Welcome to Cultivated Live for Wednesday, March 13th, 2024. I'm Jay Rosenthal. I'm the co-founder of Cultivated Media and the host of this show, Cultivated Live. And since we launched, our goal at Cultivated has been to be reader first, providing the cannabis industry with the most important, insightful, and useful information to our audience. And while we certainly would love for you to subscribe to our daily newsletter, which is linked below, we also want to meet the industry where it is, which is a lot of times on LinkedIn, a lot of times on YouTube. So that we added this daily live stream to the mix about a month ago. And today we're joined by our special guest, Jason Tarasek of Vicente, wearing the branded hoodie. I like it. Jason's based in Minnesota, which is why he's here, in addition to being a friend of me and a friend to Cultivated, and previously launched his own firm, Minnesota Cannabis Law. And that's what we're actually going to talk to him about today. Jason, welcome.
Thank you. Your little countdown made me want to defuse a bomb or something.
No, I just want, well, good. Interesting you said that, because there was a bombshell report out of New York. So good segue to that. We're going to talk about Minnesota because it was in the news this week. I thought who better to talk to than you. But before we do that, can we get to the news? Yeah. I'm going to run down the news. I'm going to tell you about the story, Jason, but I'm fearful you actually won't want to comment on it. And here's why. In a bombshell report yesterday, the New York Cannabis Insider, which is you can access on Syracuse.com, laid out a case of selective enforcement by the Office of Cannabis Management in New York as a means of retaliation and silencing those critical of the regulatory body and the state's cannabis rollout overall. Now, in the story, they describe a story about Jenny Argy, and she's the owner of a cannabis processing company that produces gummies in New York. That is important. She faced retaliation from the OCM following her publicly describing how illicit products were making their way in to the New York market, and that the OCM actually knew about it and was doing nothing about it. So she sort of outed that story. In what can only be described as selective enforcement, she started facing the wrath of the OCM, initially by being subject to the first and very public product recall of her products in the state, and later facing a full shutdown after an unscheduled inspection and a full stop work order, which quarantined all her products. Now, this apparently is this is like an open secret in New York, at least as it was described in the story. And it was not the only instance of this sort of selective enforcement. But even the New York governor, Kathy Hochul, has estimated that the rollout has been a disaster. But I think the disaster she was talking about was the glacial pace of licensing and stores opening. This story is going to have lots of fallout. I think, Jason, I'm afraid to even ask you about this story for fear that Vicente clients will feel a wrath. But it's a very challenging story to read, I think, in a very challenging market already. Yeah?
Salacious allegations.
They are salacious and well sourced, it seems, in New York Cannabis Insider, which is really the voice of the cannabis industry in New York, and troubling to read, certainly. And there were others that were quoted in the story who have sort of profile, like Ruben Lindo as well, who called it these are not his words. It was pretty harsh on the OCM as well about their selective enforcement. Maybe we should just leave that story there, lest we face a wrath. I'm not sure anybody else is watching this. I'm not sure anybody at the OCM is watching today in New York, but let's get to Minnesota if we could, Jason.
Yeah.
Because there was a story from Minnesota this week. I think we talked about it yesterday, that in Minnesota's Office of Cannabis Management was going after hemp flower. Talk to me about what is going on right now.
Well, so for about 9 months, marijuana has been legal to both possess and consume, but there is nowhere to purchase it yet, legally at least, other than unless you're a medical cannabis patient or if you want to visit dispensaries on one of our tribal lands. Mm-hmm. But as you might expect, the illicit market has been happy to fill the void. And it's no secret that you can find diverted products virtually anywhere you'd like. And there was a loophole, I think, in our regulatory scheme following the passage of our legalization bill, where no agency apparently had the authority to be inspecting hemp flower at the retail level, because our Minnesota Department of Agriculture, they test the plant as it's being grown. If you pass their test, boom, you pass out of their system. And then into which system do you then enter? Well, apparently no one's quite yet. But the Office of Cannabis Management has raised their hand and said, yes, we have inspectors now. We're going to begin inspecting cannabis flower, which may or may not be hemp. It might be marijuana. You know, the dividing line, the 0.3 delta 9. I think there will be issues related to this. I think a lot of the hemp flower will test hot for delta 9, but the other interesting thing is that a lot of it, I think, has high concentrations of THCA, which, depending on who you ask, might be legal.
Right. Can I just put a clarifying point in there? In Minnesota, you have hemp retailers, correct?
Yes. So about a year and a half ago, we passed our edible cannabinoid product law that allows for the sale of hemp-derived edible products, typically gummies or beverages. They can be sold just about anywhere without a license from anyone, so long as you register with the government and say, we're selling these things. And so the jurisdiction, or I should say, enforcement authority for that is very clearly with our Office of Medical Cannabis in our Department of Health, but the sale of actual raw hemp flower doesn't really fit in that box.
So I'm a registered hemp retailer, licensed or at least regulated or at least registered with the state. And are those the places that are actually selling hemp flower that is now getting the OCM's attention?
Well, so we're tracking the number of registrants, people saying, yes, we're selling edible cannabinoid products. And I can assure you that it is underreported by probably, fourfold.
Right.
Because this stuff is being sold everywhere. Right. Gas stations, restaurants, Girl Scout stands. Right. I mean, everywhere. And so, like I said, maybe 25% of people selling those products have actually registered, but you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a retailer of edible cannabinoid products. I think a lot of this hemp flower is being sold at smoke shops, right? Okay, and maybe some of these hemp dispensaries, but
and it sounded from the story, and I can't remember what the story was. It might have been Marijuana Moment, that like hemp flower can be indistinguishable from the flower you and I talk about. We talk about sort of dispensary flower in other jurisdictions. At least that's my read of it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the same plant, as you know, Mr. Rosenthal.
I do.
And it smells the same. It looks the same. You don't know what it is necessarily until you send it to a lab.
Right. So I guess I want to zoom out a little bit because similar actually to New York and other jurisdictions too, legalization passed either the ballot or legislatively, like it did in Minnesota. There is a gap between that period of time and when like a legal market is fully set up and regulated, like with dispensaries, retail operators, growers, producers, all that. We're in that moment now in Minnesota. And we've been in that moment certainly in New York as well and other markets. And this is where the challenge often comes, where there becomes this like regulatory morass, or it's very challenging to figure out what is going on from a regulatory perspective. And at the same time, enforcement is either non-existent or unclear. And sort of it's this in-between period, which I think it sounds like we're in Minnesota. And while New York has legalized, there's still lots of operators operating in that zone that is like unenforceable or unenforced. Is there a way for a state or jurisdiction to like cut back at that or limit that?
I think part of the problem is that our Office of Cannabis Management maybe has about 10 employees at the moment. Yeah. So they do not have, it's probably more than that. Frankly, they're growing by the day.
Right.
And they are adding inspectors, but it's a big state geographically. It's a lot of territory to cover. I think what may be interesting to watch is, like I said, our tribal nations are growing and selling adult use cannabis on their lands. The rumors are that those tribal nations are very close to finalizing some compacts, agreements with the state of Minnesota that would allow them to sell off tribal land.
Oh, interesting.
So is it going to be like a cannabis bookmobile kind of thing rolling through Minneapolis? Maybe, right?
I like that idea.
There are certain tribes that have footprints of land in the Twin Cities.
Right.
That may become our market until the more robust licensed adult use market is finalized. And there's a bill, because our legislature is in session right now. There are bills pending that would allow our medical manufacturers to sell cannabis to the tribes. And I think the unspoken part of that is that then the tribes would turn around and sell it to Minnesotans writ large.
Right. So it's I like that. I like where Minnesota's going. Can we go back to something you just said about a timeline? Like, independent of what's happening now with hemp flower and hemp dispensaries and actually dispensaries on tribal land as well. Like, what is a timeline that the OCM, I guess, is staffed up fully to actually implement what is a full adult use program? But also, like, when do you expect that we'll see dispensaries opening up and strip malls that also have targets? Like, what is the timeline in Minnesota for like a full rollout of adult use with stores opening, cultivators cultivating, processors processing, all of that? Is that this year? Is it next year? What's the timeline from your perspective?
I think the earliest we could see dispensaries open is first quarter of 2025. The main thing holding all this up is that we have not yet engaged in rulemaking. So we have a legalization bill that's been done, but OCM needs to draft the rules that are going to guide their enforcement and regulation over this industry. And they are indicating that it's going to take at least until the end of 2024 to do that. And then, of course, you can't really begin accepting license applications until rules are done. The other wrinkle here is that OCM has essentially introduced its own piece of legislation that would allow for provisional licenses for social equity applicants. So they wouldn't be able to start operating, but they would essentially have a green light to start operating the moment that the rules are approved. That's a pretty interesting idea. The other unique aspect of the OCM bill, as we're calling it, is that to the extent that more social equity applicants apply than the very small caps they have here, they would then place those applicants into a lottery and choose them that way. That's been pretty controversial, particularly among my clients who don't necessarily want their fate to rest on the whims of a ping pong ball floating to the top. I understand why OCM is pushing that. I think they don't necessarily want to evaluate every single application. They don't want to expose themselves to the litigation risk. They don't want this program tied up in injunctions forever. We keep talking about New York. There's your case study. So I get the logic there. I just don't know how well received the legislation will be once we get this into a legislative hearing setting.
That was me taking a deep breath and a sigh at the same time.
Yeah.
Because it seems like everything you just said, like in my mind, it sounds like lawsuit, and delay, because we've seen similar things in close by states like in Illinois as well, where lawsuits, there was a start, lawsuit, stop for almost a year before sort of the full ramp up. And at the same time, though, Minnesota has its own path and almost completely unique among other states and how they've sort of legalized and thought about it. So there is hope and interest and a lot of eyes sort of watching what's happening there. Are you hopeful that all those things move forward and that, like you said, first quarter 2025 is sort of the earliest to start to see that? Like, from your experience being as long as anybody else's in the industry in Minnesota, that is a timeline that is achievable, or should we tack on 6 months on top of that like in every other state?
Well, Charlene Briner, our interim director of OCM, I think she just gave a comment along the lines of, well, maybe it'll be second quarter 2025. So you can see how it might keep getting extended. I will do everything in my power to motivate them, but it's a big task. The legislators, having been up at the Capitol over the last couple of weeks, they want this market open like yesterday, but it's OCM, of course, that's doing the hard work. So
yeah. And part of me just is like, can't we just cut and paste state to state and like pick one that's working? And actually thinking about that and the question I asked before about sort of this interim period of time, there are states that have like limited that interim period of time by saying everybody who's a medical cannabis dispensary now, you have to open up basically to adult use immediately. And then we'll get to the rest of the licensing, because at least take care of the market that we know is there now in this sort of, when people are talking about legalized cannabis, people want to buy cannabis, right? They're excited about it. And so some states have like modified their path forward, I guess.
Well, imagine how complicated it must be for OCM to be doing rulemaking at the same time they're trying to pretty drastically change the statute that they're basing the rules on.
Yeah. And now trying to crack down on hemp flower somewhere, like throughout the state. There's another sigh and deep breath, Jason. So this might be the first time we've talked on Cultivated Live, like in this format. Of course, you're with us in Las Vegas, but it won't be the last, because I have a feeling there'll be lots of news coming out of Minnesota over the next weeks, months, and hopefully not a full year. Well, it sounds like it will be a full year between now and we'll start seeing things rolling in Minnesota. But Jason, I really thank you for making time this morning. You're a little bit earlier than us. You're on the East Coast. So thank you for making time, Jason.
Thank you, Jay. Great to be here.
Great to see you. And that is Cultivated Live for today. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. It's also right here. Follow us on LinkedIn or smash the subscribe button. That's what the kids make me say on YouTube. We'll be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern with Krista Raymer from Vitrina, talking cannabis retail best practices, which folks in Minnesota, they can get a head start at what they'll be setting up for in a year. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. Remember, buy cannabis at your local dispensary, unless you're in Minnesota. I guess you can go buy, I don't know, hemp flower. Go do it. Go do it while you still can in Minnesota.
Right. The clock's ticking, man.
The clock is ticking. Thanks, Jason.